Welcome back to Arguing Agile. I got a great podcast today because Om and I were talking before this podcast started and whipped up this podcast based on our experiences of joining a new team or a new company. When you join a new team as a product manager, you inherit a backlog, meaning that the teams or the business or whatever will have a backlog when you get there, and it will be your job as a product manager to say, here, Brian, here is your backlog, or here, Om, here's your backlog now. Go manage it, product manager.
Yeah, this has happened a few times in my career where I've inherited a backlog, and it has been pretty much every time it's been a kind of like a quick transition. You know, the outgoing product person basically said, here's your backlog, good luck, adios, right? There's no transition as such. So the next morning, it's my backlog. And how do I deal with that? So today, we're going to delve into various elements of, what is involved in the whole experience, I guess, of inheriting a backlog and how you deal with that.
I'm just laughing because you had a product manager to say, here's your backlog, I'm out of here. Like in the case where I come in, it's that the product manager is either the product manager is gone, or they never had a dedicated product manager. They've just all been trying to figure it out, and they're trying to bring in a professional to, quote, professionally figure it out.
So when I say that, I mean, not that the product manager was gone, but they were wearing a hat that said make product management great again.
So you're in this position where you've inherited a product backlog. Like, let's talk about things that you'll encounter in this situation. Just like, that's not going to be this podcast. This is the podcast of like, let's break out the toolkit and let's talk about like tactical, usable things that you can deploy, tactics that you can deploy to maybe dig yourself out of this trap.
Inheriting a backlog is a bit like inheriting somebody's pet, or I was going to say baby. This is something that this is dropped into your lap and now you own it. Like last night you weren't there, but now you're there. So how do you deal with this, right? So
we certainly could argue about the most important thing here. I'm going to pick this as the first thing. Feel free to go through the cut, because in the edited version of this podcast, you'll have chapter headers and it'll say number 1, whatever, number 2, whatever. If you think certain sections are more important than other ones, I even could quibble at these a little bit, because I think setting up your communication lines and whatever, I think that could be top priority. But what I picked as top priority is strategic alignment. I picked that as my top priority. Is the first thing you need to do is get with your leadership team, management team, executive team, whatever you have.
You may be very lucky in having a product manager who basically had everything aligned to strategic objectives in the backlog when they passed it on to you, right?
Or well-defined value streams, well-defined workflows of how users move through your products. Yeah, I mean,
you could be lucky.
Very lucky.
Yeah, exactly.
I've never had that, but yeah, you could.
Don't ignore this step, because at best it would be validation, right? And nobody would hold that against you. You're coming in new. Yeah. So you could say, well, here's the backlog as I have it now. Does that still ring true, right? You're the stakeholders, you tell me. And is the priority sequence still sensible from your perspective? So you don't know when the last time they were engaged in this conversation. It could be last week, it could be last year, right? So don't feel like, okay, well, it looks great to me. I'm almost half convinced that the other person did the right thing, and I'm just going to keep going. Yeah. Don't do that, because you never know. Don't assume is what I'm saying, I guess.
You're 100% right about that. Like, don't assume. As a new product manager, you cannot afford any kind of slippage between yourself and the executives. Like, if you're at a small company, 30 people, 50 people, you can't afford any. Like, you have to come in and hit the ground running as you're the expert. You're the adult in the room that they hired you, especially if you're the first product manager. And this is one of them, is if you assume that the backlog is already in line with the company's strategies and OKRs, like basically what the company cares about. Because you could find out that you have a backlog written by some rando people, maybe written by customers, development teams. I don't know who it's written by, but basically not written from the perspective of what is most valuable and useful to the company. You might end up trashing most of that stuff to say this is not where the company's strategies and what the company cares about. It's caused a lot of friction with the executives, and we need to, like, who are we working for?
The consequences are pretty grave if you do assume that, because, people trust you to know what you're doing, right? You know your craft. And if you assume that, you're basically saying, well, this is now my backlog, right? It is. The other person's gone. I just wouldn't take that chance myself. I'd rather risk appearing the fool who doesn't know anything and say, what are we doing? Why? Right? And what's important to you by when, then just simply assume.
If you can map big swaths of your backlog to strategies in which the company is engaged, or maybe if you're lucky enough and your company has OKRs, if you can tie them back to OKRs, that would be good, right? The other thing that I feel that people, like the low-hanging fruit, the ChatGPT answer to this is going to be just get as many quick wins as you can with regard to strategic direction and the executives' priorities and stuff like that. Just pound out quick wins in your first 30, 45 days. Just to get executives in the mode of like, oh, this person can produce that kind of stuff.
Well, I think that's a great idea, because one of the things it does, and you've just come in, so next 30 to 40 days or 45 days, one of the things it serves to do is build that trust with your stakeholders, that this person knows what they're doing.
Right.
They validated with us, right? They asked all the right questions, and we can confide in them. We can trust in them to deliver. That's very important.
Yeah.
There's a lot of things you can do, but these things are critical.
In terms of strategic alignment, you want to show leadership that you are on board with their goals as quickly as possible. That's why I've picked this as the first category. I also think of executives could also be stakeholders and then fall into the stakeholder. You need to set up those communication channels as fast as possible.
Yeah.
But the strategic alignment is a little bit more for me, because I also roll like the value stream mapping, like the exercise of value stream mapping. I started with a company one time as their first product manager, and one of the first things I did was I divided their teams by product. I basically divided their teams by product, which is like if you take the team topologies, they don't call it value stream, they call it the team topologies stream aligned teams. I basically, rather than a big pool of engineers, I was like, well, these people generally work on the website, and these people generally work on the mobile app, and these people generally work on the back end. So we're going to take some back end people, and we're going to take some website people, we're going to roll them together. They're going to be your fully formed value stream of your main website product. And then we're going to take maybe a back-end engineer and the mobile engineers all together, and they'll be your mobile delivery team. So I basically segmented their value stream into your mobile apps teams and your main legacy product teams. And just the act of separating the value streams, both on paper and by the backlogs of how the teams work, just that clarified so much for the company. I mean, they were blown away by like, oh, I can clearly see that, like when I want to drop stuff onto the mobile team, I show up at the mobile team refinement and I ask them about it, and developers and product can talk about it. And I was the only product manager, so I was shared across both teams, but then everybody else was dedicated to the team that they were on. So I cut a lot of communication channels in half. I cut a lot of cognitive load out of people's schedules, just with the tiny tool of org design employed in a very light manner.
I think that topic of org design is very underrated. When you come in as a product manager, you really need to figure out not just the what is being done, but what the landscape is, the org design. And you're new. Yeah. This is ideal as a time when you can come in and say, why are we doing it? And nobody will hold it against you, right? I mean, you're legitimately allowed to ask that question and then make suggestions saying, well, now going forward, can we try it this way, please?
Yeah. When you are both experienced in the field and new at the company, there is a certain amount of time where you get to basically ask all the dumb questions, or you get to ask all the taboo questions that people there don't ask. Like before, like fast forward a year and like you're just part of the carpet. Like there's just that stain's always been there. Nobody even bothers to clean it off the carpet. Like I don't know how that happens.
I know how it happens. They beat you into submission. That's how that happens.
So annoying.
You kind of fold into the ways of working, unfortunately.
Well, use it while you have it.
Correct.
Before you lose it. That's what I'm saying. I already hinted at what category 2 was going to be: stakeholder management. Stakeholder management is a massive category, but if you're going to inherit a backlog, you're going to get a lot of work items. It may not necessarily be defined in, like, written into the work item who the individual person was. Like sometimes individual people ask for a work item. So you could put a name to it, but more likely I've seen personas put to it, like, more broad personas put to it. But a lot of times there's no indication of who is this feature help. All users can benefit from this feature. Okay, great. Who do we get on the demo to, when we finish this feature, to say, hey, we like it or we don't? Like this, come on, we gotta name at least one person, at least.
Yeah, and when you ask that question, who are we doing this for? Typically, sometimes the answer is, well, the tech leads decided to do this because it's good for the product.
Oh.
Well, then they become the persona. And so I'm a big fan of persona mapping. If you can identify names in your stakeholder group with some of these personas, get their permission to use their photos and use those as the icons in your ALM tool for personas.
Yeah.
That way, people can get used to Fred or Mary is asking for this, and we can get used to learning more about these personas, right?
Yeah.
Not just what they're asking for professionally, but what's important to them, right? So, yeah, I'm a big fan of that.
If you're going to do stakeholder management exercises, which I feel that nobody does, first of all, nobody actually does this, but if I should create a little online program to do this, to help people.
Pretty cool.
If you use the little Roman Pitchler quad of low interest, high interest, powerless, powerful, the quad, where in the upper right, you got the players who are high interest and are powerful. You basically need to create context with them. You need to work with them to figure out where the direction is. And then the low interest and powerless people, basically your end users, not the software buyers, but the users of the software. Yeah. You need to let them know when new features are out and stuff like that. So they need to have a constant stream of feature expectations and feature delivery notifications and stuff like that. But each of these categories, and I'll put it in the middle of the screen so people can see, but each of these categories, they need their own line of communication. Like some of them need one-on-ones or quarterly meetings or something like that.
Yeah.
And some of them is just like an email every time you put a release out of production. Makes changes. I mean, if you're just doing back of the house refactoring or bug fixes or whatever that they'll never notice, maybe you don't even need to bother letting those people know. But maybe your high interest, low power people are like customer support, where nobody really hold a release because customer support doesn't like something. Maybe your company doesn't do that, but I mean, what they say does carry some weight. The point of this is to create a stakeholder map and then start taking the people that you interact with and that interact with your software and then start putting them into that pool and figuring out what your communication plan is for that pool. You should have 4 communication plans basically at the end of that exercise. And I don't feel that should take you that long.
It shouldn't take long. As an exercise, it doesn't take that long. But you got to figure out what's important to which stakeholder, how do they need to see it, how often do they need to see it. So there is a very common matrix out there called the communication plan or communication management matrix. Just download it, change it to suit your purpose, right? Just rows and columns like a spreadsheet that just says this person needs to know weekly, monthly, daily, whatever, in their preferred medium, right? Is it email? Is it this or that? Ultimately, if you can do that and take a holistic view and say, even though somebody said they wanted to get a daily report, let's say, but you can give them a dashboard, they might be happy with it. And then conduct a session and invite them and say, this is what we're sharing with you. Is this okay? What else do you want that's missing?
So for your key stakeholders, the people that they say matters and you can't hide anything from them, the executives, people like that, one-on-ones on a regular basis. Anybody with high authority that's on that quad that we showed, one-on-ones, regular basis. Like the one-on-ones with maybe you work for a chief product officer, maybe you work for a CTO, whoever that is, you need probably be trying to meet with them every week to align on strategic direction, what you're doing for customer pain points, complaints, anything you're hearing, because you need to know that they have your back, Yeah,
and you might encounter some resistance or friction trying to meet with them on a regular basis as one-on-ones.
Yeah.
But keep at it. Once you meet a couple of times, they'll see the value of it. Right. And be flexible, adjust to their schedule, etc. But definitely keep at it.
If you have commitments to users or other companies that have been made at a company level, like on the company's behalf. I was at a company one time that was partnered with hardware and software on the device, but the hardware is produced by a partner company. So anything that partner company we needed to respond to it because there was a hardware component, and once that deadline is missed, you're done, right? So things like that, hard deadlines, partner commitments, stuff like that needs to be reflected in your backlog somewhere. So we talked about the map, we talked about historical commitments, we talked about regular communication cadence for the different stakeholders, right? If your company is very, very small, maybe it's just your product folks and your customer success or customer support, whatever it is, just figuring out what the right cadence of talking to your customers, email blasts and posts on a forum or whatever you do. If you're larger, maybe you have PR people, maybe you have
change management people,
maybe you have marketing people, maybe you have salespeople, account management people that help with this. So if you're a larger company, maybe you can spread out and actually get help. That would be nice.
Getting help, definitely would be great. They are your allies. You coming in as a newly minted product manager, change management folks are your allies because, for one thing, they know who the stakeholders are. They've been reaching out to them already. So your job is to learn about those and then making sure they're just validating they're the right ones and the touch points are at the right frequency. If you can do that and engage with your change manager, you've already won half the battle.
I don't know if I've ever been in a place with dedicated change management other than like Scrum Masters, Agile coaches, that kind of stuff. But the creating a central place for transparency, like the product manager can do a lot to say, I'm going to drive transparency by everything's going to go here in this one place. So you can come ask me and I don't have a problem with talking to people, but also like I might be a little slow when I get overloaded, but you can always go here and see the latest whatever thing, you know what I mean? And have a strategy for transparency so that people don't have to bug you every day for that kind of thing. That would be nice.
That would be great. And you're doing yourself a favor here, right? By precluding the possibilities of various stakeholders reaching out individually and sporadically at you because you didn't have a cohesive change management plan or comms plan. So combine these together, get those out on a cadence, and that will reduce a lot of the noise that you encounter, I feel.
So let's pivot to what a lot of people probably would go straight into in this category, which I think is a mistake. Like if you don't figure out your stakeholder management plan, communication plan, and if you don't figure out how to align strategically with the organization, I feel you're setting yourself up for failure in the category we're about to talk about, which is at some point you have to sit down with the backlog and go through every work item and triage. Now, that doesn't mean you need to actually like open up and read every single work item and respond to each one or whatever. Like in some, I've been in some organizations that do internal audits that you actually do have to do that. And then you're just buried under a million feet of solid rock for the first 45 days that you're working your butt off to try to just dig out. And then when you see the light of day, then you can take off and actually set a strategic direction. If you're in that, keep your resume updated. We believe in you. Yeah, you got this. But let's say your first 30, 45 days is going through the backlog, just trying to get your team stuff to work on. Because I've heard that from product managers many, many times is I'm just trying to put stuff in front of the team faster than they can knock stuff out.
Which you would think would be a nice problem to have. Right. The issue with inheriting a backlog is you don't know what's what. To your point earlier, you got to sort out the wheat from the chaff.
You don't know the value of anything.
You don't. And an indicator of this might be that your team is discussing, looking at, working on items that are way down in your backlog order because the team's decided that's the right thing to do because they may know the priority. You don't. You've just come in, right? But no one's managed the backlog in the time that you took over. Talk about it with your teams first. Why are we working on this? Is this the right thing to work on? What are we missing if we're working on this? Those are the questions to ask. And based on that, you could go in here and start prioritizing the backlog, at least the first few items, enough for the next sprint maybe, while you are then taking a little bit of time to figure out with your stakeholders what's really the right thing to do. So give your teams enough work for the next sprint that is the higher priority work, but then figure out at a feature level or epics, whatever you're using, what's the right thing to do for this quarter, let's say, or for this fiscal year, right? You'll get a lot of direction and input on that from the previous topics that we mentioned, stakeholder management and so forth. So avoid the urge to go straight in, roll up your sleeves, go in there and go into the backlog because it's one of those things. It's like those kids going to Chuck E. Cheese or whatever and diving into the
ball pit.
Ball pit. Right? You can't see them. You don't know where they are. Right? There's too much going on. So that's what's going to happen to you if you go straight in there.
So, I have done this before. I will tell you. So whether I did it before I jumped into the ball pit or not, I'm gonna keep that. We keep that up my sleeve. There were probably 3 categories. I basically shuffled everything into either stays active, stays in the backlog, like needs further review or technical review, some sort of like I need to basically dig into this, and then things that just close it.
So I'm with you on that, right? I mean, we're about to get to my favorite part here, which is you look at umpteen gazillion items that you have in your backlog. My favorite activity is to just draw 3 columns and say now, next, later. And then the 4th column is everything else, which you ruthlessly cull.
This is a great,
delete everything.
This is a great, active needs review and archive, that you basically just did now, next, later. And what you can do is you're making multiple passes. I remember working with people as a product manager that reacted poorly to this exercise, this triage exercise. And dare I say, I could probably remember earlier in my career being a QA person reacting poorly to this exercise because I did not like the idea of we were just going to draw a line and close all these known bugs, and we're just going to say we're never going to fix these known bugs. That didn't sit well with me. The exercise of we're not going to close. If we have a little time at the end of the podcast, maybe we'll take a little time and talk about like what I've learned since then as part of QA, because you really engage your QA people to say like, we know these are bugs, we know these are issues, we're going to put them to the side, we're not going to fix them. That doesn't mean we're not monitoring them, right? But business value of fixing them and the cost that we incur by leaving them there is nowhere near what the cost that we would be willing to spend to generate new features, right? And the new business that we might bring in. So it's a cost thing. It's a business decision, and that was never explained very well early in my career, and I just didn't have visibility to it, and I never absorbed it well. And here I am, many years later. I'm like, oh, well, there you go. They're totally clear.
So I think one of the things that happens through this process is people have their own vested interests. So you said from a QA perspective, you weren't comfortable. That happens, right? Dev leads, tech leads, developers, testers, they're not comfortable at certain work items that you're saying we're not going to work on because they may have done some work before. Maybe they've done some spike stories or something, and now you're telling them you're not going to work on it. So they don't like it. Okay, fine. Yeah. But to your point, let's figure out the priority sequence from the stakeholder engagement that we discussed earlier and say to them, we're not necessarily even saying we're not working on these ever. We're saying it's not in the now, next, or later columns. So if it's not in those 3 columns, should it be in the backlog? Well, a lot of people get upset when you start to cull things from the backlog.
Well, if you're dividing between active, needs review, and archive, you would hope that everything's shuffled into the active or needs review. There's a divorcing of priority from severity or impact. Severity or impact. I don't know what you're going to call it. Some shops have those separate. I kind of think of them as the same thing. It doesn't really matter to me. But you really shouldn't be a pretty severe impact item. You should really be talking about this. I mean, I say that as a statement, but also as I say it, I'm also thinking to myself, like, well, if it happened one time, literally one time, because the machine ran out of memory because some race condition happened and then we fixed a bug underneath, like, okay. Like, we probably can close that item. We'll just watch out for it. We know what it looked like. But generally, a lot of shops that have a lot of bugs open or features open or whatever, like a big glut of backlog like this, they probably don't have a system or a field or whatever in whatever ALM tool they have. Could be a good one. Could be Jira. They probably don't have a field to measure impact separately than priority. They probably just have priority. And that's not a refined enough tool to get down to what we're saying. I mean,
it's one dimension, right? Yeah. So impact, I like to have that field as a separate field from priority. And I like to put in there in the drop-down contents of the impact, how many users does it impact? Is it one user? Is it tens of users? Is it majority of our user base? The reason is that one user could be a very critical user. Right? It's actually happened not too long ago where the user in question was the CEO of a big company, and his credentials that were being renewed with the continuing education units, they were being impacted. So it technically, as far as the numbers game goes, it's one user. So that might, in the severity or impact, that might be a lower issue. But then you look at who that user is, and then you say, oh, okay. If it's the chairman of the company, of a 300,000 employee company, that's a slightly different case now for sensitivity reasons, etc. So I guess what I'm saying is put those things in, but then look at it holistically, right? What kind of users are they? Are they admin users? Are they this class or category of users? Based on that, make the decision. Don't be afraid to move things away from their, normal buckets, so to speak, right? Based on these other things that you discover.
I'm starting to think about the needs review category, that middle, hey, we got to take a deeper dive into this or look at it. It's sort of like the parking lot. Sometimes you think about the parking lot as the archive, we're never going to look at this type of thing. Like, oh, we're going to put that in the parking lot and then we never come back to it. That's not the way I think about the parking lot. The parking lot's, hey, it's not part of the active discussion we're having right now, but it does need to be talked about. You can't go out in the parking lot and have the parking lot be the giant stadium parking lot and the NFL stadium of a parking lot. That's not a parking lot. I'm never going to find my car in that parking lot. Like, it needs to be reasonable. Yeah. So if you're putting it in the parking lot, that means you're deferring it. You're going to get to it later. It doesn't mean that you might as well close it at that point where you're never going to come back to it.
So I lean toward that. And the reason behind that, you could just say it's on a future roadmap.
Right.
Put that as a status.
Right.
It's a future roadmap item, but we don't need to see it in the backlog right now. Right. In which case, what you could do is extract that out into an external tool like Excel or whatever, Google Sheets, whatever, tool of your choice, and then delete them. from your LM tool. And now they get upset. So I meet them halfway and say, we're not deleting them. We're removing them from the backlog, but they're not gone for good. Because I'm going to give you a spreadsheet with those. You hang on to it. If it's there, you can easily import it back in.
Well, you can search. I mean, you can things in whatever tool you're using. You can still search.
You can. You got a filter then, right? If you have it.
That would be a helpful tool in an ALM tool to have, is when you start entering the replication steps of a bug or the description of a bug or something like that, the actual helpful AI feature would automatically search and look for similar items to say, hey, this might be a bug that already exists in the system. Yeah. And then to suggest like a sidebar or something that says like, maybe this is this, because that might be a quick way to find a closed item that we have intentionally marked as not going to fix, and then maybe you have a new customer service person who doesn't know about so if your tools can automatically be searching the backlog as the person enters, it might just pop up like, hey, did you know, like on this date 6 months ago, the product manager put in a comment that says this is a low-hanging thing. When the user gets it, just tell them to clear their cache and refresh your browser, and then they'll be fine.
This is a great addition, and it's not even looking for things that are necessarily closed. It could be things that are in an archive, future roadmap, etc.
Stuff like that.
So yeah, take note, Alex. Yeah, I like that suggestion.
Yeah, because Lord knows Jira is never going to get to this. Like a helpful feature to manage your backlog, never. So there's a category inside of doing our assessment and our triage that could be its own podcast. We have done a podcast on technical debt, but this is the time to sit down with your tech leads or your architect, or maybe if you're a small company, your team does it, right? To say, what are the things that if we don't solve are going to hold us back? And then if they hold us back, what is on the other side of that? Before, when we were planning for this podcast, we had a discussion about like a lot of libraries in Python have dependencies, right? You have to be on a 3x version, a 3.7 version, 3.8 version. And if most of your scripts are written with Python 2.7, like there's no way you can go to a 3.12 library, because it has, like, you can't even go back a couple of versions, let alone back to 2x.
And you need those features that are in those libraries.
You'll say, well, if I want to use these libraries to do these things, that's like this work item that says upgrade to a currently supported version of Python. Like, this has to be done. So you can show like true blockage, like dependencies, like blocker dependencies. Like if we unlock this thing, all this world will be available to us.
Yeah, that's the flip side of it, right? Yes. So you're showing business value of doing that. The business value is potentially we could tackle and deliver this new functionality if we upgrade to the latest version, right?
That's like the reverse of like what everyone thinks of as technical debt. Technical debt, people think of as, well, these are things that limit us. But this is like, if we do this
They're
thing,
enablers,
and honestly, then the more preparation we do, the more the technology will enable us to launch into the future. But if we don't stay current, our runway is much shorter and shorter and shorter, and we just don't have a lot of decision-making capability out to the future. Yeah. And then we'll have to stop and have a big thing, and hopefully our company's in a good stage. It's just a bunch of stuff that nobody has a lot of patience for.
Exactly.
Like let's avoid that by just making intentional decisions with the technology, and this is where you go back to this is where a good CTO makes their money, right?
And there's a lot of players in this mix, right? So architects and so forth. Looking at tech debt, just final word on that, would be ruthless about tech debt that you know isn't really going to open any doors, but people have reported that, maybe one person or no one else has complained. Yeah. Get rid of it. It doesn't matter. If it becomes relevant later, you can add it back in, but you don't need to entertain it. Right. It's just the deeper your backlog is, the worse your cognitive load is on looking at that backlog. So you want it as shallow as possible in terms of the number of items, but you want it deep in the sense of the acronym.
Right.
Right.
Let's move to operational data, a review of operational. When I say operational data, I mean, I'm talking about analytics, customer use. I'm talking about the feedback from customers and quantitative data gathering. Qualitative and quantitative data is what I'm talking about. Yep. So I've been in a lot of companies that they're just struggling to get from point A to point B. Hey man, what are you talking about? Self-actualization over here. You're talking about being your best self. I'm just talking about finding a place where I can sleep for the night without rain coming down on my head. Like, Brian, get out of my office with this stuff. It's super important for you to have metrics about the usage of your product. Because if you don't, like at this point, we're just talking about opinions. And I will tell you, as a product manager, QA person, dev team member, like, you will lose to the highest paid person in the room's opinion when it comes to we don't have any data. We're just going by opinions. You will lose.
For sure, 100%. Absolutely, you will lose, right? So what are some of the things that we would recommend in this scenario? Let's break that down.
Well, you got to have analytic usage. You got to have metrics and usage of features in your app. You got to be able to see how users are using the features of your app through logs, statistics, metrics, stuff like that.
Telemetry for your product.
Yeah.
What about when we look at the operational data review, current functionality that's out there? How do we know how well that's landing? How do we know that? Is the capability already in the product where we can sense and respond based on that? Are we getting those signals, or do we need to enable that capability? Yeah. Well, if we need to enable it, if it's already there, then fine, right? You can just look to enhance that. But if it's not there, what you're now doing is you're adding to the backlog those capabilities that will serve you well, but they're missing.
So I've been at a lot of companies. I know it's not a shocker. I've been at a lot of companies, and a lot of people here probably listening also have been at a lot of companies where their like metrics are terrible. There's a lot of assumptions. You know what I mean? I would start by building metrics into the application around the core features of the application. I would do core, whatever's beyond, like a core adjacent, and then periphery. Like I would draw concentric circles, and I would just start with the core features. What is the absolute core of our software? And then I would make the case to management to start building observability into the application, starting with the core, to say, hey, we think that we're realtors now. Brian Ohm's software realty company, like we sell houses now. What are our North Star metrics from our customers? Like, I don't know, maybe the number of appointments for tours booked, right? Maybe another one is like the number of houses viewed on our app. Maybe that's another one. I mean, there's probably a couple of them. Like a few. Number of houses purchased through
conversion rates,
something like that. Like I would start with like, well, what is our core? Like we probably could sit here and think of a dozen metrics,
right?
But what is the core? Like the core is how many houses have we sold
over a unit of time. One of the things I would say here, I think you were spot on when you said draw concentric circles. The alternative would be to draw a bell diagram. Just do a bell curve and go, okay, take the tails and then look at everything in the middle and say, do we get signals on how well that's landing, right? That's the majority of our features with the majority of our users.
Right, yeah.
Now, having done that, don't discard the tails yet. Look at that and say, that one user that's at the beginning of the tail or at the end of the tail, what's important to them? It may be that they don't use a lot of features, but the one they do use, you can't live without. It must be in the product. Yeah. Don't just go by the raw numbers, but that's a good start to figure out, are we learning about how well? So I use this term, fitness for purpose. Yeah. How well is our product fit for purpose? Yeah. You can't be all things to all people, right? You got to figure that out. Who's your audience? Are you landing well with the majority of your audience? And then you're adding to the backlog. Already to the big backlog that you've inherited, but you're adding the right things for the right reasons.
Mm-hmm. Going back to something we said earlier in the podcast about transparency, like once you are collecting some of these metrics, you don't even have to do it all.
Yeah.
Once you're collecting some of these metrics, you can create a real-time dashboard that people can go to, and you start pointing everyone back to that. There are companies that I have started with. This is completely true. I have started with companies as a product manager. They've had no metrics, zero. I start with like number of logins, the application, number of usage of this function, something like that, and then it snowballs from there. And then we end up having like 2, 3, 4 metrics that we all care about, and then over a year and a half, it's like a dozen, 18 metrics, and then we want to look at logins over time. And executives want to see, they want to build a baseline over time to know if things are out of the norm or in the norm or whatever. And it becomes a whole thing, and it's a whole dimension of data they didn't even have until I started pressing in the backlog to say, hey, let's cover the core in metric usage so we can know if we're rising or falling or whatever over time, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Increasing, decreasing over time. The point of that story was it's a metric that becomes a main part of the business that people want to see every single day, basically.
I'm a big fan of visualization. And the nice thing is today we have all these tools available to us, right? The iTools and whatnot. So what this allows you to do is get away from the drudgery of creating status reports and crap that, right? Yeah. You can just say, well, you want to know what's going on? Here's a link to our dashboard. It's real time. I'm a big fan of that. But yeah, to your point, don't try to fix everything on that dashboard at once. Just add to it gradually over time. Ask the consumers of the dashboard, what is it that they want that they're not seeing on the dashboard today? And then serve that up over time.
You know, the other thing that it's not on our list to talk about, but I just thought about this. If you have a dashboard and you can break it down by, let's say you're a company that has multiple customers, you could get with the software buyer per customer and create some kind of metrics for that software buyer to let them know, hey, this is, because sometimes when you're in B2B, you don't have the best contacts with the software buyer, but boy, it'd be nice to say, like, here's an aggregate snapshot of all your software users to show you that they are finding these features valuable and they are using it. You know what I mean? This is not something that you bought and they're not using. Like, this is the insight from all of what we're doing for your company. And props to you if you can kind of connect that to value if you have that kind of information in your system. But boy, it's just nice to know that, like, hey, you made a good decision. And then when it comes renewal time or BD visits or whatever, like, you got some numbers. At least that's you're not sending your BD people in there like sight unseen, completely blind.
I think that's excellent. You're leading with data at that point, right? Which is great. I mean, what better than do that than just say, look, listen, this is how we've served you, and if you extrapolate, this is how we plan to serve you.
Let's talk about process optimization. This is the point that now we enter all of everybody that normally listens to our podcast, like, only now
actually paying attention.
Are most people entering. We're talking about process optimization. We're talking about standardizing workflow for new backlog. We're talking about like a template for writing backlog items. We're talking about an actual process around your Kanban or a Scrum or whatever. We're talking about actually having processes. Mm-hmm. We're talking about defining acceptance criteria, coming up with a definition of done, like all the kind of things. Like, only now that we've walked through all these different steps of, like, is it important to my strategic management? Like, is it strategically important to management? Is it aligned with my stakeholders? Is it important to them or not? Is it, we've gone through a triage of what can we do in what order, and we're going to rank some things just to figure out. I mean, we got so many things we don't know what to work with. Maybe we have a backlog of 500 things. We don't even know where to start. Like, we've done the triage process. We've started with things that we think are important. We've tried to bring operational data into it, and then only now are we at the point. Because remember, we ranked these before the podcast began, right? And I said we could argue about what's important. Like, only now we got to the point where we need to create a stable process to bring the stable process into control, to get new work and incoming work and existing work kind of aligned. And this is when we get our refinements on the calendar. This is when everything becomes stable.
You could say that without you even coming in and taking over as a newly minted product manager, taking over a backlog, all of this stuff should be happening anyway. So presumably, if we're talking about this and you're thinking through this in your own specific cases, it's not happening or it's not happening well enough, partner with your process guides, like your Scrum Masters, people like that, your Agile coaches, partner with them and just ask them questions. Are we doing this? If we're not doing this, can we start doing that? That's really the way to go about this, I think. Well, standardization is one of those things that if you go into your team, you're new, remember, right? Go in and say, we're going to standardize on this. You may get some pushback. Just position that as, here's how we've been doing things. What are some of the challenges we've seen? Mm-hmm. And listen when they talk. Listen. And then say, well, what if we were to create a template that would do away with these challenges because we can get these things straightened out up front? Yeah. That's how you would standardize, instead of, I've come in and this is my way or the highway. You're not going to get anywhere with that. So yeah, there's ways you can do this, but you definitely need to pay attention to standardization and making sure they're as optimized as possible, but it's not a one and done. Mm-hmm. It's not like you're going to get done through a session and say, we're done now. It's going to be iterative over time. So these are changes we've made to our processes. Let's see if they're working well or not. And be open to ask your teams and say, we decided to do things a different way. Right. How well is that working? Right. And if they say, well, we don't like X, feel free to accept that and change it. Right. So that's how I would position it to begin with. It's not like, this is how we're going to work from here onwards. Yeah. Let's try this. Treat that as an experiment.
Yeah. One of the things I like to do is I like to, for a lot of companies that don't have Scrum Masters, Agile coaches, whatnot, I like to, people will say partner with your tech lead, you know what I mean, your engineering manager, tech lead, whatever. And a lot of those people they'll want that responsibility. So let's put that aside for a second. I like to say, as the incoming product manager, I need a retro where we work on the business, and I need a backlog refinement where we work in the business. I need to have those two things and own the backlog refinements. Those are my sessions. So I invite whomever I feel needs to be there to the backlog refinements. Could be stakeholders, could be other teams, could be managers, whatever. It could be, I've invited executives when I feel that we've crept too far from strategic items of strategic importance. And it could be engineering management when we're dealing with overly technical type of things that we need to correct, right? Could be whatever, but I am lining up, and that's my domain, to line those things up. The retros, that is for the team. Okay. So I need to kick out anyone that's going to keep the team from openly communicating what we think the real blockers are that could just make us go faster.
Yeah.
What are the things that we can do in the organization? And then I'm taking what they're doing. I'm hoping the engineering lead or team lead or whatever we have is in there with their listening ears on rather than blaming people or whatever. We're working on the process, on the business, on the ways that we work together, our team and other teams. And I am working on the work, in the business, on the work. I need those two things started right away. Personally, that's just the way I work. I need those two things started right away for us to start taking off. I need those parallel tracks of work for us to start taking off.
Yeah, so even though in this podcast we've laid out these as kind of in a sequential manner, don't feel like you have to stick to that, right? So this could go one or two, number two maybe, right? It doesn't matter, whatever, because everything's contextual. So that's the one thing I wanted to just say. You'll see this in the notes, but it doesn't mean that you have to prescriptively follow the sequence, right? Feel free to adjust that. But yeah, I agree with you. I think it's a very important point you just made.
So, like the other thing that I don't know if we really talk about this, but the quote resource planning. Like a resource could be, or a resource in this instance means, are the teams cross-functional? Can they deal with all the problems? The teams that I talked about earlier in this call, where I divided them between like a mobile team and a web app team. When I got there, they had a couple front-end developers, a couple back-end developers, a couple mobile developers. The front-end people only worked on front-end stuff. The back-end people only worked on back. And then the engineering manager kind of divided between them, played this chess game, or I guess checkers game. I don't know what kind of game. So some kind of game that I really didn't understand, to be honest.
It's Chinese checkers.
About where it goes. And this planning of, hey, I've got these people. And like, for example, I had a QA engineer who really never did any QA engineering work. He really just did manual testing because that's all the team could provide him with.
Yeah.
Because they didn't have any infrastructure or anything on the ground up. The developers weren't supporting him. And it's tough to be a QA engineer when the developers aren't supporting you.
Sure.
So things like that. I was like, there's some gaps here in the people and the systems that we work on, resource planning. And it was very difficult to get capacity when you're a development mob. It's very difficult to figure out 6.7 hours per day per person. That all once you have a little tiny problem or a bug crops up that takes a half a day to investigate, all your capacity numbers get blown out of the water.
Sure.
So this was very difficult to do. And I want to say there are some things in here like training needs, developing cross-functional skills, getting people to peer. Like there's some things in here that I want to talk about, but I also don't even want to talk about this category because this category is the lowest priority to me, because I think all this falls into place if you're doing everything else that we talked about well.
Yeah, 100% concur with that. I do think that we have to, product people, look at the backlog on the one hand, look at your team makeup on the other hand, and say, do we have the right skill sets available to deliver this backlog or part of it, right? Yeah. What skill sets are missing from our teams? Yeah. And what do we need to do to get that? Do we need to borrow team members from our own organization, from other teams? Or do we need to upskill people? Right. Do we need to get consultants in for a period of time to kind of inject that in? Whatever the option is or options are, you need to think through that, right? Because these will become blockers for you.
I'm glad you said that, because it kind of it took my mind on a whole different path that I wasn't considering when we started talking about it. When I was like, actually, this is not a useless category, because we've walked through this whole podcast from the perspective of you have an effective product person starting who understands teams and understands the work and is experienced, right? I don't know what you do with this when you don't have an experienced product person, right? Let's put that aside for a different podcast. Inexperienced product people. We just talked about, I need to make sure that my team has developers to do the work. Like if they have test skill, it's manifesting. If they don't have test skill, I need to get a tester to help the team with testing. Maybe they're deploying, maybe they're not. Maybe that's because I was at a company one time that only it was a very small company, and only the CTO could release the pipelines and deploy the pipelines to production, because nobody else knew how to roll the software that was getting checked into builds to roll out to releases to go to production. But he was the only one that had any DevOps skill. And I was like, why are you the CTO? I need you doing architectural work, and I need you doing future technology work and researching, and we haven't even gotten to any of the process optimization stuff, because a good developer and a good tester and a good architect may not know what a good scaled, well-working teams that interface with the business looks like. Right. So that agile coach skill, they might not have any of those skills. Not no fault of their own. Maybe this is the only place they've ever worked in their whole career. they've never had to work in any other environment other than this environment. And now that the company is doubled in size, they're out of their element. That's not their fault that they're out of their element. It's just things have progressed.
No, I agree with that. As a product person, you need to keep your eye on these things, right? They're not that far out, meaning like if these things are an issue for you, you need to resolve them now. These things take a while to resolve, especially things like getting new skill sets on board. How fast can you upskill people? Or how fast can you negotiate contracts to bring in a contractor with all the onboarding and everything else that goes into play? So knowing that, especially with an experienced product manager, you can get ahead of that and say, let's plan this out. Let's put these features a little further down because we don't really have all the skill sets that we need. But work with your team for sure, right? And trying to come to a conclusion on that. But that should be part and parcel of what you're looking at on your backlog.
Like it should be, but I can't. This is like it's an intersection of product and the technology and like a couple different departments.
Yeah, it is.
And this is where a lot of companies break down, is at where we're saying right now is like, what skills do we have right now? Like skills, not people. What skills do we have right now? And then 3 years from now, what skills will we need? And then how do we get from point A to point Z? We're so bad at just talking about the day-to-day work. This stuff is so far from the day-to-day work.
But it's critical, right? And even companies or organizations that have roles like delivery managers who you think should be thinking through this stuff.
No, they're project
They don't do that. They're project managers. They're not focused on this stuff.
I mean, you know why? Because it's everything we're talking about right now is leadership skill. To say where is the organization at now, or team, right? Where's the team at now, and where will the team need to be 2 years in the future, 3 years in the future? That is a leadership question and a leadership answer to get you there, right? That building that roadmap of like, this is where I need to take the organization in the future. This is how I need to change the design of the organization to future-proof us. Once we start talking about leadership on the podcast and the need for org design changes,
we're done. Well, thank you all for staying with us this far. Hopefully this has been an illuminating topic for you. It certainly was for me when we started discussing the subject as a whole. Let us know what else you'd like us to talk about. And don't forget to ring that bell down below.